She went into the dense forest to be alone with herself, but she strayed from the path and found a strange white pallet house that didn't belong among the trees. One night inside forced her to make a choice she wasn't ready for. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. She did not decide to leave her life behind. That would have required clarity, conviction, or at least anger. What she felt was none of those things. Her life had not collapsed. It had thinned. It had grown light, almost transparent, like a fabric worn so long that the body beneath it began to show. Nothing dramatic had happened recently. No catastrophe. No sudden betrayal. No sharp loss that could be named and explained. Instead, there had been years of quiet erosion, the kind that left everything standing while hollowing it out from the inside. She was 47 years old. Her body still obeyed her, though with less generosity than before. She woke each morning without pain, but also without expectation. The mirror reflected a woman who looked capable, even reliable, and that, more than anything, troubled her. She had become someone others assumed was fine. The divorce had been finalized 3 years earlier. It had unfolded politely, almost courteously, like the closing of a shared account rather than the end of a shared life. They had spoken of practicalities, divided objects, agreed on dates and signatures. What they didn't discuss was the slow disappearance that had preceded it, the way conversations had turned into logistics and then into silence. When it was over, there was no relief, only a strange calm that lasted too long and began to resemble emptiness. Work had followed the same pattern. She had not been fired in a dramatic sense. Her position had been restructured, then reimagined, then quietly removed. She had accepted a temporary contract elsewhere, then another. Each role required less of her than the last, not because she was incapable, but because no one seemed to expect more. She performed adequately, reliably, invisibly. The days passed without friction, and with them passed her sense of weight in the world. It was not sadness that drove her into the forest. Sadness would have been easier to name. What she felt was a dull neutrality, an emotional flatness that frightened her precisely because it did not hurt. She found herself thinking, with an alarming lack of resistance, that if something were to happen, if she were to vanish from the familiar grid of routines and obligations, it might not matter very much to anyone, including herself. The idea of the hike came to her without ceremony. She did not frame it as an escape or a challenge. She did not tell anyone she was going. When she booked the route, she chose a stretch of forest known to be quiet, but not dangerous, far from popular trails yet still marked on official maps. It was the kind of place recommended to people who wanted solitude without courting disaster. That seemed appropriate. She was not trying to test herself. She was trying to step outside the constant background noise of her own life. Preparation was minimal, almost intentionally so. She packed what was necessary and little else. Food for a few days, water purification tablets, a sleeping bag rated for cooler nights, a small stove. She left behind comfort items she might once have considered essential. There was no journal, no book, no music. She brought a phone but powered it down before leaving the car, not because there would be no signal, but because she did not want the option. The act felt less like bravery than resignation. The forest received her without comment. The first steps along the trail were unremarkable, the path wide enough to suggest prior use, but narrow enough to discourage groups. The air was damp and layered with the scent of leaves and soil. Light filtered unevenly through the canopy, breaking into fragments that shifted as the wind moved the branches above. She walked steadily, not pushing herself, letting the rhythm of movement replace thought. As the hours passed, the world simplified. Her attention narrowed to physical sensations, the pressure of the straps against her shoulders, the slight pull in her calves, the sound of her boots on the ground. Time loosened its grip. There was no schedule to keep, no one waiting for her return at a specific hour. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt something close to relief, though even that word seemed too heavy. It was more accurate to say that she felt less. The forest was not welcoming in a sentimental sense. It did not offer beauty as reassurance. There were no dramatic vistas, no clearing that invited rest. Instead, there was a steady sameness, trees repeating themselves in subtle variations, undergrowth thick enough to block sightlines beyond a few yards. It was easy to imagine getting lost here, not suddenly, but gradually, by degrees so small they would be noticed too late. That thought did not alarm her. If anything, it settled into her mind with an unsettling ease. She made camp the first night near a shallow stream, careful to leave no visible trace. She ate without appetite and slept lightly, waking often to unfamiliar sounds that resolved themselves into wind, water, or small animals moving through the underbrush. Each time she opened her eyes, she felt briefly disoriented, as if she had not yet decided where she belonged. The second day began much like the first. She packed up, followed the marked trail, and let herself drift into the physical simplicity of walking. Yet something had shifted. The forest seemed denser, the path less defined. She consulted her map, confirmed her direction, and continued. It was only later, when she encountered a stretch where the trail narrowed abruptly and disappeared beneath a tangle of fallen branches, that she hesitated. The sensible choice would have been to turn back, retrace her steps, find a clearer route. She stood there for several minutes, weighing that option. There was no urgency pressing her forward. Nothing compelled her to continue, except a quiet, stubborn refusal to retreat. She told herself it would only be a short deviation, a way around the obstruction. She stepped off the trail and into the trees. The ground changed almost immediately. The undergrowth thickened, and the forest floor became uneven, forcing her to slow down and watch each step. She moved carefully, marking trees in her mind, maintaining what she believed to be a straight line. Yet the deeper she went, the more the sense of direction blurred. The forest did not announce this loss with drama. It simply stopped offering reference points. She checked her map again, then her compass. Both told her she was still oriented correctly, and yet, something felt wrong. The silence had deepened. The usual background sounds of birds and insects had faded, replaced by a stillness that seemed intentional. She considered turning back, but the way behind her no longer looked familiar. Every tree resembled the next. It was then that she noticed the light change. Ahead, through a gap in the trees, there was a brightness that did not belong to the forest. It was not the scattered glow of sunlight filtering through leaves, but a solid, uninterrupted white. At first she thought it might be rock, or perhaps the exposed side of a fallen tree bleached by time. She moved toward it cautiously, her curiosity tempered by a growing unease. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. Straight lines emerged where there should have been none. Angles interrupted the organic curves of the forest, and then, unmistakably, there was a wall. The structure stood among the trees, as if placed there deliberately, and then forgotten. Its surfaces were white, not with the dull gray of weathered wood, but with a pale, almost sterile brightness that caught the light and reflected it back into the shadows. It was not large, but it was complete. A small house, assembled from pallet panels, stood in the middle of the forest, where no house should have been. She stopped several yards away, her first reaction not fear, but confusion. The building did not look abandoned in the way abandoned things usually do. There was no visible rot, no graffiti, no sign of vandalism. Nor did it look temporary. The panels were fitted carefully. The roof sloped with intention. The small windows placed symmetrically. It looked less like a shelter hastily erected, and more like something designed, constructed with patience, and left intact. She felt a faint irritation rise in her chest, an almost personal offense at the sight of it. The forest had been consistent until now, predictable in its indifference. This structure disrupted that balance. It demanded explanation. She circled it slowly, noting the absence of a path leading to it. The ground around the house was undisturbed, the vegetation growing close to the walls as if it had been allowed to reclaim the space gradually. There were no footprints, no discarded materials, no sign of recent activity. And yet the house stood firm, clean in a way that defied its surroundings. The question formed in her mind with increasing insistence. Who would build something like this here, and why? She told herself she would look for a moment longer and then leave. But she did not move away. Instead, she found herself standing in front of the door, her hand hovering just short of the handle, caught between the instinct to retreat and the pull of a curiosity that felt heavier than reason. The forest behind her was silent. The White House waited. And without fully understanding why, she stayed. She remained standing in front of the door, longer than she would later remember admitting to herself. The handle was simple, unpainted metal, slightly dulled, neither rusted nor new. It did not gleam invitingly, nor did it warn her away. It existed in the same neutral state as everything else about the structure, refusing to suggest intention. The house did not feel abandoned, but neither did it feel occupied. It was simply there, complete and waiting, as if waiting were its natural condition. Her first instinct was not fear. That came later, in diluted fragments. What she felt now was irritation mixed with disbelief. The forest had already unsettled her by absorbing her sense of direction without effort. This was worse. This was a contradiction, a thing that should not exist according to every rule she understood about places like this. She had walked long enough, far enough, to know the difference between a remote hunting shelter and something else entirely. This was not improvised. This was not a ruin reclaimed by nature. It was too deliberate for that. She stepped back and forced herself to look again from a distance, as if clarity might arrive if she adjusted her perspective. The house was modest in size, no larger than a single-room cabin, but its proportions were exact. The pallet panels were arranged in a way that suggested careful measurement. The seams aligned cleanly. Whoever had built it had taken time, not only to assemble it, but to decide how it should be seen. The color troubled her most. White did not belong here, not the white of bone or stone bleached by weather, but a deliberate, applied whiteness that still held its shape. It reflected light unevenly, catching brightness even under the canopy, making the structure visible from angles where everything else dissolved into shadow. It was not trying to blend in, and yet it was not marked, labeled, or advertised. It did not announce itself. It simply existed. She began to circle the house slowly, keeping a careful distance at first. Her steps were quiet, cautious, as if sound might matter. The forest floor was soft with needles and damp leaves, muffling her movement. Each side of the structure revealed the same restrained logic. The windows were small, placed higher than eye level, their glass intact and clean. They were not positioned for views, she noticed, but for light. The roof sloped gently, constructed from the same pallet material, sealed well enough to keep out rain. There was no chimney, no obvious ventilation, no sign of an external heat source. What struck her as much as the house itself was everything that was missing. There was no path leading to it, no clearing carved out of the forest. The vegetation pressed close to the walls, as if the structure had been set down and then deliberately ignored. Moss crept toward the foundation, but not aggressively, as if held at bay by something unseen. There were no tool marks left behind, no scrap wood, no evidence of construction debris. Whoever had built it had taken care to remove all traces of the process. She stopped at the back wall and rested her hand briefly against the surface. The wood was cool and dry. Solid. It did not flex under her touch. This was not a temporary shelter thrown together out of desperation. It was meant to last. Her mind moved through possible explanations with increasing speed, each one collapsing under closer scrutiny. A ranger outpost would have been marked, connected by some kind of service road. A private retreat would not be built so anonymously, nor with materials this conspicuous. An art installation made no sense this far from public access, with no plaque, no documentation. Even the idea of someone hiding here felt wrong. The house was too visible for secrecy, too orderly for survivalism. She felt the first stirrings of unease then, not sharp enough to frighten her away, but persistent enough to make her aware of her own vulnerability. She was alone, off her intended route, standing before a structure she could not explain. The rational response would have been to leave immediately, to mark the location mentally and return to familiar ground. She told herself that was exactly what she would do. Instead, she found herself moving closer to the door. Up close, she noticed the absence of decay. The hinges were clean. The threshold showed no sign of repeated foot traffic, but also no damage. There were no scratches from animals, no signs of attempted entry. The handle turned slightly under her fingers when she tested it, not opening, but confirming that it worked. The door was not locked. That fact unsettled her more than if it had been. She withdrew her hand and took another step back, scanning the forest around her. The trees stood motionless, their trunks rising in silent repetition. There was no movement she could see, no sound to suggest she was being observed. And yet the awareness of being somewhere she did not understand pressed against her thoughts with increasing weight. She tried to recall how long she had been walking since leaving the trail. Time had blurred. It might have been minutes or hours. The forest did not offer easy measurements. She considered the remaining daylight, the supplies she carried, the distance she would need to cover to return to known ground. All of it felt suddenly abstract, less real than the solid presence of the house before her. Curiosity returned, no longer gentle but insistent. It was not the thrill of discovery that motivated her, but a quieter, more troubling impulse. She felt as if the house had interrupted something in her, brought into focus a question she had been avoiding for years. The structure stood there without explanation, and in doing so, mirrored her own state. She had built a life that functioned, that stood upright, that showed no obvious signs of collapse. And yet when she looked closely, she could no longer explain why it existed as it did. She moved closer again, this time without hesitation, and placed her hand on the handle. The metal was colder than she expected. She paused, not because she feared what might be inside, but because she sensed that opening the door would change the nature of her presence here. Until now, she had been an observer, a passerby. Crossing that threshold would make her something else. She listened once more. The forest remained silent. When she turned the handle and pulled, the door opened smoothly, without resistance, without sound. There was no creak, no protest, no sudden rush of air. The door swung inward, as if it had been waiting for this moment. She stood in the doorway and did not step inside. The interior was dim, but visible. Light filtered through the small windows, illuminating a single, contained space. There was no chaos inside, no disorder that would suggest intrusion or abandonment. Everything was arranged with an almost unsettling precision. She could see a low bed against one wall, a narrow table, shelves built directly into the structure. The floor was clean, too clean. The absence of personal detail struck her immediately. There were no clothes, no photographs, no objects that carried the weight of ownership. It was not empty in the sense of being unfinished. It was empty in the sense of being prepared. She took a slow breath and stepped across the threshold. The air inside the house was dry and still, carrying no distinct scent. It did not smell of age or neglect. It smelled neutral, as if it had been sealed off from time itself. The temperature was cooler than she expected, but not uncomfortable. The space held its own climate, separate from the forest outside. She turned in a slow circle, taking in every detail. The walls were smooth, the pallet boards sanded and sealed. The joints were tight. Nothing rattled when she shifted her weight. The floor did not creak. This was not a structure built quickly or carelessly. It had been assembled by someone who understood not only materials, but intention. As she moved deeper into the room, her initial unease softened into something more complex. The house did not repel her. It did not feel hostile. If anything, it felt strangely accommodating, as if it had been designed to receive someone exactly like her, someone who would notice the absence of excess, the refusal of ornamentation, the quiet discipline of the space. She ran her fingers along the edge of the table and noticed faint marks, repeated at regular intervals, almost identical. Not damage, but use. The same motion, performed again and again by someone who sat here for long stretches of time. On the shelf above, there were several identical cups, neatly arranged, all clean, all empty. Why more than one, she wondered, when everything else was designed for solitude? The thought unsettled her. She moved to the bed and pressed down gently on the mattress. It was firm, functional, clearly used, but carefully maintained. The bedding was folded with precision, not casually tossed aside. There was no indentation that lingered, no sign of recent occupation. Whoever had slept here had done so long ago, or had erased their presence deliberately. She straightened and took another look around the room, her awareness sharpening. Patterns began to emerge. Objects repeated in sets, spaces left intentionally blank. Everything was arranged to be replaceable, interchangeable, anonymous. It was as if the house itself resisted the idea of a single owner. A quiet realization settled over her, sending a faint chill through her chest. This place had not been meant for living in the ordinary sense. It had not been built for comfort or permanence. It was something else entirely. She stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the careful order of someone else's design, and felt the first true tremor of fear. Not fear of harm, but fear of understanding. Because even without knowing who had built this house, or why, she sensed that it was not an accident she had found it, and that whatever purpose it served, she had already stepped into it. She closed the door behind her without fully realizing she had done it. The movement was slow, almost instinctive, as if the act of stepping inside demanded completion, demanded enclosure. When the latch settled into place with a soft, final click, the sound echoed in the small space more loudly than she expected. It was not an alarming noise, but it carried weight. Something about it suggested that the boundary between outside and inside now mattered. For a moment she stood still, her back to the door, listening. The forest sounds were immediately muted, reduced to a distant, indistinct presence. Wind no longer brushed leaves near her ears. The subtle, constant movement of the woods faded into a low silence that felt deliberate. The house absorbed sound, held it, softened it. She had the unsettling impression that once a noise entered this space, it did not escape easily. She turned slowly and faced the interior again, this time with a different awareness. Before, she had looked as a discoverer. Now she looked as someone temporarily contained. The room was not large, but it did not feel cramped. The proportions were balanced in a way that made the space feel complete, as though nothing more could be added without disrupting it. There were no corners left unused, no angles that invited clutter. Light entered through the small windows in a controlled manner, diffused rather than bright. It revealed textures without dramatizing them. The pale walls reflected just enough illumination to eliminate harsh shadows. Everything was visible, and yet nothing demanded attention. It was a room designed to be seen fully, without distraction. She took a few steps forward, testing the floor beneath her boots. It was solid, firm, carefully leveled. There was no give, no complaint from the wood. The floor had been sealed properly, protected from moisture, suggesting an understanding of the forest's habits. Whoever built this place had known the land well enough to anticipate its slow, persistent attempts at decay. Her eyes moved from object to object, tracing the quiet logic of their arrangement. The table was positioned where the light fell longest during the day. The bed rested against the wall farthest from the door, offering a sense of distance and safety without retreat. Shelving lined one side, built directly into the structure, not added later. Everything belonged, and yet, nothing belonged to anyone. That absence pressed against her more insistently now. In ordinary dwellings, even sparse ones, there were always traces of personality, small betrayals of habit or taste. A chipped mug chosen over others, a book left open, a chair angled slightly toward a favored window. Here, nothing deviated. Every object appeared as though it had been selected not for preference, but for function alone. She approached the shelves and examined their contents more closely. The cups were identical, plain and durable, arranged with careful symmetry. There were more than one, more than necessary. The same was true of other items. Simple utensils, folded cloths, spare material stacked neatly in corners. It was as if the house anticipated replacement, not continuity. She felt a subtle tightening in her chest. The space resisted intimacy. It did not invite her to settle in or make herself comfortable. Instead, it offered neutrality, a kind of emotional blankness that reflected her own internal state, with uncomfortable precision. She moved toward the small heating unit mounted near one wall. It was compact, efficient, and entirely self-contained. There was no external chimney, no visible exhaust leading outside. She examined it carefully, noting the absence of soot or residue. It had been used, but not heavily. Maintained, but not relied upon. The more she looked, the more the house seemed designed for a specific kind of stay. Not long enough to accumulate possessions, not short enough to be accidental. A pause, a suspension. She found herself thinking of waiting rooms, of places where time lost its usual shape. Airports late at night. Hospital corridors between decisions. The house carried the same atmosphere, stripped of urgency but heavy with implication. She returned to the center of the room and sat down on the edge of the bed, more out of curiosity than fatigue. The mattress held firm beneath her weight, neither yielding nor resisting too much. It was functional, supportive, without softness. Sitting there, she became acutely aware of her body, of the way it occupied space. There was no mirror in the room, no reflective surface that might offer her image back to herself. She existed here without reinforcement. For the first time since entering the forest, she felt the edges of unease sharpen, not into fear, but into a heightened awareness of choice. Nothing in the house compelled her, nothing restricted her movement, and yet the space exerted a quiet influence, an unspoken suggestion that she remain exactly as she was, neither advancing nor retreating. She stood again and crossed to the table. Running her fingers across its surface, she noticed faint, repeated marks. Not scratches, not damage, but impressions, as though someone had rested their hands here in the same position many times. The spacing was precise, the pattern unmistakable. This was where someone had sat, repeatedly, returning to the same posture, the same place, over and over. A strange thought occurred to her then, uninvited and unsettling. Perhaps this house did not belong to one person. Perhaps it belonged to many, not simultaneously, but sequentially. The idea lodged itself in her mind and refused to be dismissed. She examined the walls more closely and noticed subtle variations in the wood, tiny differences in wear that suggested age, but not neglect. Everything here had been used carefully, deliberately, and then restored. The house bore the marks of presence without the marks of possession. The door behind her felt more significant now. She turned and looked at it, half expecting it to have changed in some way. It remained the same, plain and unremarkable. She realized, with a faint shock, that she had not once thought about locking it. The idea seemed irrelevant. Whatever purpose this place served, security from others did not appear to be part of it. She moved back toward the shelves and noticed something she had missed before. On the far side, partially obscured by the alignment of the structure, there was a section where the wall panels differed slightly in grain and color, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to suggest intention. She ran her hand over it and felt the faintest indentation, a seam disguised with care. Her pulse quickened, not with excitement, but with apprehension. She withdrew her hand, unsure whether she wanted to uncover whatever lay hidden there. The house had already revealed more than she was comfortable with. It had exposed her to herself in a way she had not anticipated. She checked the light again, estimating the time. Daylight was fading, though not yet gone. She told herself she would not stay long. She would leave before nightfall, return to the trail, accept the discomfort of retracing her steps. The rational voice in her mind urged retreat with increasing insistence. And yet, she did not move toward the door. Instead, she remained where she was, standing in the center of the room, allowing the silence to deepen. The house did not pressure her. It did not demand exploration or understanding. It simply existed, offering its quiet order as a mirror. As minutes passed, her thoughts drifted inward despite her resistance. Memories surfaced, unbidden. Not dramatic ones, not moments of obvious regret, but small, accumulated decisions. Times when she had chosen the easier path, the quieter response, the option that required the least confrontation. None of those choices had been wrong in isolation. Together, they had brought her here. She realized then that the house felt unsettling, not because it was strange, but because it was honest. It offered no narrative, no explanation, no comfort. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. A place designed for someone who had reached a point where ordinary life had paused. The forest outside had absorbed her sense of direction. The house inside absorbed her sense of identity. She did not yet understand why this place existed, or who had created it. But she understood something else, with a clarity that unsettled her more than any mystery. This house had not been built for survival. It had been built for reckoning. And as the light continued to fade beyond the small windows, she sensed, with a growing heaviness in her chest, that staying any longer would require more than curiosity. It would require facing whatever part of herself this place had been waiting for. The night was coming, and she had not yet decided whether she was ready to meet it. The light did not disappear suddenly. It withdrew in stages, retreating from the corners first, then from the upper sections of the walls, leaving the floor visible last, as though the house itself were deciding how much of the outside world to allow inside. She noticed the change without marking the exact moment it began. Time inside the structure no longer behaved in a way she recognized. Minutes passed without shape, stretching and folding into one another until duration felt irrelevant. She stood near the table, watching the pale illumination thin along the surface of the wood. The forest beyond the windows darkened into a dense, indistinct mass, no longer offering depth or detail. What had once been layers of trunks and branches collapsed into a single dark presence pressing against the glass. The house did not brighten in response. There were no automatic lights, no concessions to comfort. The fading light felt intentional, almost instructional. Only then did she fully register the weather. A low sound reached her ears, muted but persistent, like distant movement through fabric. Wind, she realized. It moved through the trees with increasing force, not violently, but insistently, bending branches, carrying moisture. Soon after came the first dull taps against the roof. Rain. Not a sudden downpour, but a steady, deliberate fall, as if the forest had waited until she was fully inside before closing itself. She approached one of the windows and looked out. Visibility was already poor. The white walls of the house reflected faintly in the glass, superimposing her own shape over the darkness beyond. She could not see the path she might take if she left now. Even if she stepped outside, the forest would offer no guidance. The thought of navigating it in this condition stirred something close to fear for the first time. She turned back into the room and felt the subtle shift that came with that decision. Until now, staying had felt provisional, something she could reverse at any moment. With the weather turning and the light failing, remaining inside became less a choice and more a necessity. The house was no longer just a discovery. It was shelter. She removed her pack and set it carefully on the floor, aware of how deliberate her movements had become. Each action felt heavier, more consequential, as though the space were recording them. She took off her jacket and hung it over the back of the chair, noticing how naturally it fit there, how the chair seemed to accept it without complaint. The house made no demands, but it accommodated with unsettling ease. As darkness settled fully, the interior took on a new character. Shadows deepened, but did not distort. The outlines of objects remained clear, their shapes intact. The silence thickened, no longer merely an absence of sound, but a presence in itself. The rain continued, steady and rhythmic, striking the roof and walls in a pattern that felt deliberate, almost meditative. She sat down on the bed again, this time without hesitation. Fatigue crept into her muscles, but it was not the exhaustion of physical exertion. It was the weariness of prolonged restraint, of holding herself in a state of suspension for too long. The house seemed to sense this. It did not soften or comfort her, but it allowed her stillness. The sounds of the night intensified gradually. Wind threaded through the trees with a low, continuous murmur. Rain shifted in tone as it struck different surfaces. Occasionally, a branch scraped against the exterior wall, the sound muffled but unmistakable. None of it felt threatening. And yet, the awareness of isolation sharpened. She was not merely alone. She was enclosed. She rose and moved toward the heating unit. The temperature had dropped noticeably. The forest air, heavy with moisture, pressed against the structure, and though the house resisted it well, the chill crept inward. She examined the unit again, then activated it with careful movements. It responded quietly, emitting a controlled warmth that spread slowly, evenly, without sound or scent. The lack of fire, the absence of flame, felt appropriate. This was not a place for spectacle. As warmth returned to the room, something else followed it. A sense of being held, not physically, but psychologically. The house did not distract her from her thoughts. It gathered them. She sat at the table and rested her hands where the faint marks indicated others had done the same. The position felt strangely natural. Her fingers settled into the grooves as if guided. She did not withdraw them. Memories began to surface then, not with urgency, but with persistence. They did not arrive as vivid scenes or emotional outbursts. Instead, they appeared as moments of recognition. Small choices revisited with new clarity. Times she had chosen silence over confrontation, stability over desire, acceptance over change. None of these decisions had felt wrong at the time. They had been reasonable, even responsible. Yet here, in the quiet neutrality of the house, she could see how those choices had accumulated, layering over one another until movement itself had become difficult. She thought of her marriage, not of its ending, but of its middle years, when dissatisfaction had been present, but unspoken. How she had learned to anticipate expectations and meet them without question. How that skill had gradually eroded her ability to want anything distinctly. She thought of her work, of how competence had replaced ambition, how being dependable had become a substitute for being engaged. The house did not judge these thoughts. It did not validate them either. It simply allowed them to exist fully. The night deepened. Outside, the forest became impenetrable. She no longer attempted to look beyond the windows. The outside world had receded, leaving her entirely within the boundaries of the structure. And with that retreat came an unexpected sensation. Calm. It disturbed her. The calm was not relief. It was not peace. It was the absence of pressure. No one required anything from her here. No role waited to be performed. No expectation hovered. The house did not ask her to be anything. And in that absence, she felt the dangerous appeal of remaining exactly as she was. The thought emerged quietly, without drama. She could stay, not forever, perhaps, but long enough for the rest of her life to fade into abstraction. The house would allow it. The forest would conceal it. There would be no confrontation, no explanation, no need to justify the choice. She could simply remain, suspended between before and after. The realization frightened her more than any imagined threat. She stood abruptly, pushing the chair back, the sound startling in the silence. Her heart beat faster, not with panic, but with recognition. This was the test the house offered. Not survival, not endurance, but choice. She moved restlessly through the room, her thoughts circling. The house did not interfere. It did not tighten around her or react to her agitation. Its neutrality was absolute. It would accept her staying or leaving with equal indifference. She returned to the bed and sat down again, forcing herself to breathe slowly. Outside, the rain showed no sign of easing. The night stretched on, unbroken. She realized she would have to sleep here, whether she liked it or not. Leaving now would be reckless. The forest would not guide her back. It would swallow her. She lay down, fully clothed, and stared up at the ceiling. The pallet panels above her formed a simple pattern, each piece aligned with care. She traced the lines with her eyes, grounding herself in their regularity. The warmth from the unit steadied the air. The rain softened into a background rhythm. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was shallow and fractured. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her thoughts continuing even as her body rested. Each time she woke, the house was the same, unchanged, waiting. At some point in the deep of night, she became aware of something she could not immediately name, a sense of attention, not observation, not presence, but awareness, as if the house, the space itself, registered her existence without responding to it. She sat up slowly, listening. Nothing moved. The silence held. It was then that she understood something fundamental. The house did not impose fear. It did not create danger. What it offered was far more unsettling. It removed distraction. It stripped away the noise and obligation that usually shielded her from herself. Here, she could no longer pretend that her life had stalled due to circumstance alone. The night was not hostile. It was revealing. As the hours passed and the darkness slowly loosened its grip, she felt the first subtle shift toward morning. The rain eased. The wind softened. Light did not return yet, but the pressure of night began to lift. Exhausted but alert, she sat at the table again, hands resting in familiar grooves, and waited. She did not know yet what she would find when the day came, but she understood that the night had already done its work. The house had tested her, not by threatening her, but by offering her exactly what she thought she wanted. And she had survived that offer. The dawn was approaching, and with it, the next reckoning. Morning did not arrive with clarity. It crept in gradually, loosening the night rather than breaking it, easing its way through the small windows in a pale, uncertain wash. The forest outside remained indistinct, its shape softened by lingering mist and the afterweight of rain. Inside the house, the air felt changed, not warmer, not brighter in any decisive way, but lighter, as though the space itself had released something it had been holding through the night. She sat at the table when the first true light reached the floor, her hands resting where they had rested so many times before without her realizing it. The grooves beneath her palms felt more familiar now, less alien. They no longer seemed like marks left by strangers. They felt like evidence, proof that others had passed through this same posture, this same pause, and had left without spectacle. Her body ached slightly from the restless night, but the discomfort was grounding. She welcomed it. It reminded her that she was present, awake, still capable of responding. The calm that had frightened her in the darkness had receded, replaced by a quiet alertness. She did not feel resolved, but she felt receptive, as if something within her had shifted just enough to allow movement. She rose and moved through the room slowly, seeing it again with morning eyes. The neutrality remained, but it no longer felt oppressive. The space had not softened, but it had become legible. The order she had noticed before now seemed intentional in a way that went beyond design. This was not merely a place stripped of excess. It was a place shaped to avoid attachment. Her gaze returned inevitably to the section of wall she had noticed the night before. In the clearer light, the difference in grain was more apparent. The panels aligned perfectly, yet the wood there carried a slightly different tone, a subtle deviation that only revealed itself with careful attention. It was not a flaw. It was a signal. She approached it without hesitation now. Whatever fear she had felt during the night had transformed into a steady resolve. She ran her fingers along the seam and felt again the faint indentation. This time, instead of withdrawing, she pressed. The panel shifted slightly beneath her touch, not enough to open, but enough to confirm what she already suspected. This was not damage. It was a mechanism. She applied gentle pressure, experimenting with the panel's movement until it gave way with a soft, controlled release. The section of wall swung inward just enough to reveal a narrow recess. There was no sound of surprise, no rush of air. The house yielded the space as if it had been waiting for the right moment. Inside the recess was a shallow compartment, clean and dry, protected from the elements as carefully as the rest of the structure. Within it lay a small collection of objects, arranged with the same deliberate precision she had observed everywhere else. There were no personal items, no photographs, no tokens of memory. Instead, there were thin wooden slats, each marked with symbols burned into the surface. She removed one carefully and examined it. The mark was simple, unmistakable. A date, etched with care, followed by a single word. Not a name, not a sentence, just a word. She set it aside and took out another. Another date, another word. The pattern repeated. She laid them out on the table, arranging them instinctively, sensing that order mattered. There were more than she had expected. Dozens, perhaps. The dates spanned years, decades even. They were not evenly spaced. Some clustered together, others separated by long intervals. Whoever had recorded these entries had not followed a schedule. They had responded to moments. She read the words slowly, letting each one settle before moving to the next. Left. Stayed. Returned. Chose. Waited. Continued. The simplicity of the language was disarming. There was no explanation, no elaboration. The words did not justify themselves. They did not tell stories. They marked decisions. A realization began to form, quiet but insistent. These were not logs of occupancy. They were not records of construction or maintenance. They were acknowledgments. Each slat represented a moment when someone had reached a threshold and named what they did next. She felt a tightening in her chest, not of fear, but of recognition. The house was not anonymous because it lacked history. It was anonymous because it refused to assign ownership to any one story. It did not belong to the person who built it, nor to those who used it. It belonged to the moment itself. She imagined the people who had come here, not as characters, not as dramatic figures, but as individuals much like herself. People who had reached a point where forward motion had stalled, where the familiar paths no longer offered direction. They had found this place, or perhaps been led to it by some internal logic they could not name. They had stayed long enough to decide something essential, and then they had left. Or they had not. She noticed that not all the words suggested departure. Some implied continuation without movement, stayed, waited, continued. The house did not promise resolution. It did not demand action. It provided space for honesty and nothing more. She sat back in the chair, the weight of the discovery settling into her. The house had not been built to hide people. It had been built to remove the noise that usually prevented them from hearing themselves. It stripped life down to a single question, asked repeatedly, without variation. What now? She gathered the slats and returned them carefully to the compartment, leaving everything exactly as she had found it. She did not feel entitled to leave her own mark among them. Not yet. Perhaps never. The house did not require participation. It did not seek to grow. It remained complete in its restraint. When she closed the panel, the wall resumed its seamless appearance. Nothing about the room suggested what it concealed. The knowledge she had gained felt internal rather than physical, as if the true revelation had occurred somewhere beneath her awareness, waiting only for confirmation. She returned to the center of the room and stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly. The morning light had strengthened, illuminating the space fully now. The house looked smaller in daylight, less imposing. It was still strange, still out of place, but it no longer dominated her perception. It had given her what it had to give. She thought again of the calm she had felt during the night, the dangerous appeal of remaining suspended, untouched by consequence. She understood now that this, too, had been part of the design. The house did not coerce. It tempted with stillness, with the relief of not choosing, but it did not make that choice for anyone. Her own reflection emerged, uninvited, clear and unsparing. She had spent years waiting without admitting it, waiting for circumstances to change, for dissatisfaction to resolve itself, for life to present her with a direction she would not have to claim as her own. The house revealed that waiting itself was a decision, one she had been making repeatedly without naming it. She felt no shame in that realization, only clarity. The forest outside began to assert itself again, sounds returning gradually as the night loosened its hold. A bird called somewhere beyond the windows. Leaves stirred. The world resumed its quiet insistence on movement. She gathered her belongings and packed them carefully, aware that this act marked a transition. She was not leaving in flight. She was not escaping. She was moving forward with intention, however tentative, Before stepping toward the door, she paused and looked around one last time. The house did not look back. It offered no farewell, no sign of recognition. Its purpose was complete the moment she understood it. She opened the door and stepped outside. The forest received her differently now. Light filtered through the canopy with renewed clarity. The air was cool, clean, alive with subtle motion. The white house stood behind her, unchanged, its surfaces catching the light without reflecting meaning. It did not beckon. It did not warn. She knew she would not speak of this place, not because it was secret, but because explanation would diminish it. The house did not need witnesses. It needed only those willing to face what it offered. She turned away and began to walk, her steps steady, her direction clear enough for now. The house remained where it was, waiting for the next moment, waiting for the next person who would need to choose. She did not hurry as she moved away from the house. That, more than anything else, marked the change. There was no urgency in her steps, no backward glances driven by fear or longing. The white pallet house remained visible between the trees for several moments longer than she expected, its pale surface catching the morning light and holding it without warmth or invitation. Then the forest closed around it, quietly, without ceremony, and it was gone. The path ahead was not immediately clear, but she did not feel lost. The forest, which had seemed indifferent and vaguely hostile before, now revealed subtle signs she had failed to notice earlier. The slope of the ground, the thinning of the undergrowth, the way light pooled more generously in certain directions. She followed these cues without overthinking them, allowing her body to move with a confidence that surprised her. As she walked, she became aware of a lightness she had not felt in years. Not happiness, not excitement, but a loosening. Something inside her had released its grip. The questions that had pressed against her for so long were still there, but they no longer demanded immediate answers. They had been named, and that was enough for now. The forest sounds grew richer as she moved deeper into it. Birds resumed their cautious calls. Insects stirred. Leaves shifted under small, unseen movements. Life asserted itself not dramatically, but persistently, reminding her that motion did not require justification. It simply required participation. She thought briefly of the people whose decisions had been marked inside the house, of the words burned into wood without explanation or narrative. Left, stayed, returned, continued. None of them promised fulfillment. None of them guaranteed relief. They acknowledged only action, or the absence of it, and the honesty required to recognize the difference. She realized then that she did not need to record her own decision anywhere. The house had not demanded it. The forest did not require witnesses. The only place her choice needed to exist was within her own awareness. Her pace remained steady as the terrain gradually softened. The dense undergrowth thinned, replaced by more familiar patterns. She recognized the subtle reemergence of a trail, faint at first, then increasingly defined. When her boot finally struck packed earth rather than leaf-littered ground, she paused, not from surprise, but from acknowledgement. She had found her way back, or perhaps she had been guided to it. Standing there, she considered the life she would return to. Nothing external had changed. The same unresolved situations waited. The same uncertainties remained. There was no sudden clarity about work or relationships, no detailed plan unfolding in her mind. But the paralysis that had held her for so long had weakened. She no longer felt suspended between possibilities she refused to name. She resumed walking, following the trail now with a quiet assurance. The forest opened gradually, allowing longer stretches of light, broader views between the trees. The sense of enclosure lifted. With it came a subtle grief, unexpected and sharp, not for the house, but for the years she had spent waiting without understanding that she was waiting. She allowed the feeling to pass without resistance. Grief, she understood now, was not an enemy. It was a marker, a sign that something had been recognized and released. When she reached the edge of the forest and glimpsed the open space beyond, she did not stop. She crossed the boundary without ceremony, stepping back into a world that felt both familiar and altered. The sky was brighter here, the air less dense. The sounds of distant human activity drifted faintly toward her, reminders of connection and consequence. She reached her car in the early afternoon. It stood exactly where she had left it, unchanged, patient. She set down her pack and rested her hands on the roof for a moment, grounding herself in the solid reality of it. The journey had not taken long in measured time. Inwardly, it felt immeasurable. Before getting in, she looked back once more toward the forest. She did not try to locate the house. She knew she could not, even if she wanted to. The forest had already reclaimed its boundaries, preserving the place not through secrecy, but through indifference. She understood then that the house would not disappear. It did not need protection. It would remain as long as there were people who reached the quiet edge of themselves and needed a place where nothing distracted from that moment. It did not promise answers. It offered space. She started the car and pulled away slowly, the road unfolding ahead of her with familiar predictability. The sense of forward motion did not overwhelm her. It steadied her. She did not imagine dramatic changes awaiting her. She did not romanticize the clarity she felt. She knew it would fade at times, tested by habit and fear. But it would return, because it had been earned. As the forest receded in her rearview mirror, she did not feel the need to mark the experience as extraordinary. It had been simple, contained, and exact. A pause. A reckoning. A choice acknowledged. The rest would unfold as it always had, one decision at a time. And this time, she would know when she was choosing to wait. The road carried her forward, indifferent and reliable, and she followed it without resistance, aware that she was no longer merely moving through her life. She was moving within it. If this story stayed with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to the channel to see what comes next, watch our other stories, and follow along as new ones are released. Share this video with someone who appreciates thoughtful, meaningful stories, and let it reach those who might need it.